The old Ashwood Cemetery had always been a place of local legend. Nestled deep within a dense forest, it was rarely visited, save for the few brave souls who sought its sinister reputation. They spoke of strange occurrences, whispered voices, and the feeling of being watched. On a cold October night, I decided to see for myself if the legends were true. I parked my car on the edge of the forest and began my trek through the moonlit woods. The path was narrow and winding, with gnarled tree branches arching overhead like skeletal hands. The further I walked, the thicker the fog became, until I could barely see a few feet in front of me. After what felt like hours, I finally arrived at the cemetery gates. They were rusted and overgrown with ivy, barely discernible in the dim light. I pushed them open with a loud creak and stepped inside. The air was still, and the silence was oppressive. The moon cast long shadows across the gravestones, giving the whole place an eerie, otherworldly feel. I wandered among the tombstones, reading the names of those long gone. Some were so worn by time that they were illegible. As I moved deeper into the cemetery, I noticed a mausoleum standing on a small hill. Its marble facade gleamed in the moonlight, and an inexplicable urge drew me toward it. The door to the mausoleum was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Gathering my courage, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was damp and cold, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the shadows. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the interior, revealing rows of stone coffins. In the center of the room was an ornate sarcophagus, more elaborate than the others. Its lid was covered in strange symbols and inscriptions that I couldn't decipher. I felt an irresistible urge to open it, as if something was calling to me from within. With trembling hands, I pushed the heavy lid aside. Inside lay a skeleton, its bones yellowed with age. Clutched in its bony fingers was a small, leather-bound book. I reached in and carefully removed it, feeling a chill run down my spine as I did. The book was covered in dust, and its pages were brittle and yellowed. I opened the book and began to read. The text was written in an ancient, forgotten language, but as I continued, the words seemed to rearrange themselves into something I could understand. The book told the story of a powerful sorcerer who had been buried alive in the mausoleum as punishment for his dark deeds. He had vowed to return from the grave and seek revenge on those who had wronged him. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the room was filled with a low, guttural whisper. I looked around, but saw nothing. The whispering grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, each one filled with anger and despair. I tried to close the book, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if my hands were glued to its pages. A shadowy figure appeared at the edge of my vision. It was a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, just like the sorcerer described in the book. He moved closer, his footsteps silent on the stone floor. "You have disturbed my rest," he said in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I'm sorry," I stammered, backing away. "I didn't mean to." The sorcerer raised a skeletal hand, and the book flew from my grasp, landing open on the sarcophagus. "It is too late for apologies," he said. "You have read from the book, and now you are bound to my fate." The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting around me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The sorcerer began to chant in that ancient, forgotten language, and the shadows tightened their grip. I felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around my throat, and my vision began to fade. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, the door to the mausoleum burst open, flooding the room with moonlight. The shadows recoiled, and the sorcerer let out a furious roar. I fell to the floor, gasping for air. A group of ghostly figures entered the room, their ethereal forms glowing with a soft white light. "These are the spirits of those he wronged," a voice whispered in my ear. "They have come to stop him." The spirits surrounded the sorcerer, their light growing brighter and brighter until I had to shield my eyes. When I finally looked again, the sorcerer was gone, and the shadows had vanished. The book lay closed on the sarcophagus, its cover scorched and blackened. I stumbled out of the mausoleum and ran back through the cemetery, not stopping until I reached my car. As I drove away, I glanced back and saw the spirit standing at the gates, watching me. I knew then that I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. It was a cold and dreary October night when I decided to explore the old Ravenwood Cemetery, a place whispered about in local legends. Known for its eerie atmosphere and dark history, the cemetery had been abandoned for decades. Little did I know that this night would turn into a nightmare beyond my worst fears. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an otherworldly glow over the tombstones. I parked my car just outside the rusted iron gates and stepped out into the chilling night air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. With a deep breath, I pushed open the creaking gate and ventured inside. The path through the cemetery was overgrown with weeds and lined with weathered gravestones. As I walked deeper into the graveyard, an unsettling feeling crept over me. Shadows seemed to dance at the edge of my vision, and the air grew colder with each step. Suddenly, a soft whisper echoed through the night, sending a shiver down my spine. I stopped and looked around, but saw nothing but darkness and stone. I shook off the feeling and continued walking, my flashlight beam cutting through the thickening fog. Ahead, I spotted an old mausoleum, its stone facade cracked and covered in ivy. Intrigued, I approached it, noticing the heavy iron door slightly ajar. Against my better judgment, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was damp and smelled of decay. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the interior, revealing rows of crumbling tombs. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back towards the tombs. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the room. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It moved closer, and I could see it more clearly now. A tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. His clothes were tattered, and his skin had a sickly pallor. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a raspy voice. I'm sorry," I stammered, backing away. "I didn't mean to intrude." He continued to advance, his eyes locked onto mine. "This place is cursed. Those who enter never leave." I turned and pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but it remained firmly shut. The man's footsteps echoed closer, and I could feel his cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, ready to plead for my life, but he was gone. The mausoleum was silent again, save for my ragged breathing. I slowly backed into a corner, my flashlight scanning the room. Suddenly, a hand shot out from one of the tombs, grasping my ankle. I screamed and kicked, but the grip was unrelenting. A chorus of ghostly whispers filled the air, growing louder and more frantic. The hand pulled me down and I fell to the ground, my flashlight rolling away. The whispers turned into wails of agony, and I saw spectral figures emerging from the walls, their faces twisted in torment. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the door, clawing at it with all my strength. Miraculously, it swung open, and I stumbled out into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I jumped in, slammed the door, and sped away, not daring to look back. As I drove home, the whispers still echoed in my ears. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and my mind raced with the horrors I had witnessed. I vowed never to return to Ravenwood Cemetery, but the memories haunted me long after that night. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home. I see shadows in the corners of my vision and hear whispers in the dead of night. Ravenwood Cemetery is a place of nightmares, and those who dare to enter may never truly escape its grasp. If you ever find yourself near Ravenwood Cemetery, heed my warning. Stay far away. Some places are better left forgotten, and some spirits are better left undisturbed. To this day, I cannot explain what happened that night. The book and the sorcerer, the spirits and the shadows. All of it seems like a terrible dream. But I know one thing for certain. I will never set foot in Ashwood Cemetery again. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, and some doors should never be opened. The legend of Greenwood Cemetery was one that the locals rarely spoke about. Situated on the outskirts of the small town of Eldridge, the cemetery was a place shrouded in mystery and fear. Tales of restless spirits, inexplicable lights, and eerie sounds had kept people away for generations. One crisp autumn evening, I decided to uncover the truth for myself. I arrived at the cemetery just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The iron gates, old and rusted, creaked open with a push, revealing a winding path lined with ancient tombstones. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves, and a dense fog rolled in, adding to the cemetery's ominous atmosphere. With a deep breath, I stepped onto the path and began my exploration. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, casting long, flickering shadows. As I walked, I felt a growing sense of unease, as if unseen eyes were watching my every move. I had heard about the grave of Eleanor Blackwood, a young woman who had died under mysterious circumstances a century ago. Her story was one of love, betrayal, and a curse that had supposedly plagued the town ever since. Intrigued, I decided to find her resting place. The path twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the cemetery. The further I went, the colder it became, and the silence was only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. Eventually, I found myself standing before Eleanor's grave. The headstone was elaborate, adorned with intricate carvings, and an epitaph that read, "Here lies Eleanor Blackwood, beloved and betrayed. May her soul find peace." As I stood there, a sudden chill ran down my spine. The fog thickened, and my flashlight flickered. I felt an inexplicable urge to speak. "Eleanor," I whispered, "if you are here, give me a sign." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a cold wind swept through the cemetery, and I heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that I could barely make out the words, but it sounded like someone calling my name. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help me." My heart raced as I looked around but saw no one. Gathering my courage, I followed the voice, which seemed to be coming from a small crypt nearby. The entrance to the crypt was partially hidden by overgrown ivy and appeared to have been undisturbed for years. I pushed aside the ivy and descended the stone steps. The air inside was cold and stale, and my flashlight revealed cobwebs and dust-covered coffins. In the center of the crypt was a large, ornate sarcophagus, its lid slightly ajar. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I approached the sarcophagus and hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside, instead of a corpse, I found a small leather-bound diary. I picked it up and began to read. The diary belonged to Eleanor Blackwood. Her final entries detailed her life and the events leading up to her death. She wrote about a man named Thomas, whom she loved dearly, and his betrayal with her sister Margaret. Heartbroken and filled with despair, Eleanor had taken her own life, but not before cursing Thomas and Margaret, ensuring that they would never find peace. As I read the last entry, the air around me grew colder, and the whispering became more urgent. "Help me find peace," the voice pleaded. "Eleanor," I said softly, "how can I help you?" The pages of the diary flipped on their own, stopping at a page with a map of the cemetery. There was a spot marked with an X near an old oak tree. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to go there. I left the crypt and followed the map to the oak tree. As I approached, I noticed a small, unmarked grave. The earth looked undisturbed, but I knew this was the place. I began to dig with my bare hands, the cold soil biting into my skin. After a few minutes, I uncovered a small wooden box. Opening the box, I found a locket inside. It was tarnished but still beautiful, with a portrait of Eleanor on one side and Thomas on the other. I felt a wave of sorrow and anger emanating from it. as if the emotions of the past were still trapped within. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see the ghostly figures of Thomas and Margaret, their faces twisted in anguish. They reached out towards the locket, but an unseen force prevented them from touching it. "Eleanor," I said, holding up the locket, "I have found what you seek. What should I do with it?" "Destroy it," her voice whispered, filled with both sadness and relief. I placed the locket on a nearby rock and, with a heavy heart, smashed it with a stone. As the locket shattered, a piercing scream filled the air, and the ghosts of Thomas and Margaret vanished, their tormented souls finally freed. The fog lifted, and a sense of peace settled over the cemetery. I felt a gentle breeze, and for a moment I thought I saw Eleanor's spirit standing beside her grave, a look of gratitude on her face. Then she too disappeared, her soul at last finding the rest it had been denied for so long. I left Greenwood Cemetery that night, knowing that I had witnessed something extraordinary. The curse of Eleanor Blackwood was finally broken, and the spirits that had haunted the cemetery were at peace. The experience left me forever changed, a reminder that some legends are more than just stories, and some souls are bound by more than just the grave.